Hi class, Professor Cook here. You might be wondering why I'm not recording video. I'm just doing screens and audio. And part of the reason for that is to reduce the size of these files. It's not that I don't want to record a video. Also, that way I don't have to really, put on makeup or anything or do my hair, but I'm just teasing. All right, so today I wanted to wrap up our slides on stratification and poverty. Last time we talked about social mobility and we discussed the differences between horizontal and vertical mobility, intergenerational and intragenerational mobility. Please make sure you understand these. There will definitely be exam questions asking you to apply these different terms similar to what we did at the practice. Okay. So finishing up this unit, we're going to discuss poverty in the United States mostly, and I'm going to also be posting a PDF that explains these different measures of poverty. I asked you for your in-class assignment to look at the Gini index. That is a measure not of poverty, but inequality between people in a specific country. So we'll get into that again in a minute, but let's just kind of go forward through the last of these slides. So I'm sure that you are aware that of course this current experience is affecting people's ability to support themselves. Joblessness claims, unemployment claims are going up dramatically through this period, and I think we're seeing just how vulnerable major sectors of our economy and our workforce are to layoffs and things like that. Okay, so just to kind of go through the numbers here, poverty is increasing. We actually saw, I want to just amend this a little bit. We were seeing a slight decline in this 15% before this most recent issue with COVID, but I'm guessing this is back up. So this is what I want you to remember for a statistic for exams, etc. So 15% of our population lives in poverty. How do we know that? How do we define that? We're going to explore that in a minute. This is an increase from roughly 45 years ago, where we had about 11%, and at the same time that poverty has increased, inequality has increased as well. And you can imagine that this year, 2010, we were still feeling the effects of the recession of 2008, and that was likely why this was increasing. I'm guessing we're going to see another increase here in the next couple of months, again, due to this current crisis. Okay. So in the United States, the video that I had you watch was showing that we actually have more inequality than we've ever had in our country, and it's astonishing, really. Like I knew that we had inequality. I had learned about it. I had studied it, but I didn't know it was that extreme, honestly, until 10 years ago or so when I started teaching this content. Unfortunately, we have a higher rate of women and children living in poverty. Usually this is because of single parent households being headed by women. And as we're going to look into in the next set of slides, women often make less money on average than men. Okay, so the feminization of poverty is a term referring to the fact that female-headed households are more likely to be poor. Children under 18 are 36% of those living in poverty, and women are about 58%. These numbers may look slightly confusing. There are more poor whites than Latinos or blacks, but this is numbers, not percentages. The poverty rate is higher for non-whites, however, meaning the percentage of this population that experiences poverty is higher than the percentage of the white population that experiences poverty. So more numerically, but not as a relative percentage of the population. We call this a disparity. When there are differences in the rate of poverty or the rate of incarceration or something like that for one group relative to their population size as compared with another group. This question is just that interpretation I just walked through about numbers and counts versus percentages of a population. Don't stress too much about that. I just kind of want you to understand what those numbers are referring to here. Okay, this is where it gets a little bit complicated, so I want you to definitely look over the PDF that I will post that I made. And I want to add some explanation here. So we're making this distinction between absolute and relative poverty. This is more about how we measure poverty and the poverty line than it is about what you or me or any person experiencing poverty would understand as their experience, okay? In other words, these terms are about how we're measuring poverty, not the qualitative experience of it. Okay, so the United States uses an absolute measure of poverty. Technically, what we mean by this is not having enough money to afford basic necessities of food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, etc. Absolute poverty. How we measure this is based on a 60-year-old, 50-year-old calculation that I'm going to go into in a minute in the PDF too. So what I want you to remember, the United States uses an absolute measure of poverty. The poverty line that we calculate annually changes because, of course, the price of things changes, but it is intended to measure what you need to exist, basically, and support yourself for those basic needs. That's the intention, okay? Relative poverty is a comparison of where you are with the average standard of living. So many European Union countries use a relative poverty measure where they take an average household income, and if you are making below 60% of that average, you would be considered to be living in poverty in those countries. Okay? So relative poverty is a measure that takes into account the average household income of a specific population. Relative poverty takes into account the average household income of a specific population. Absolute poverty does not. It is calculated based on different variables. Okay. Again, the United States uses a very old calculation. I don't mean to laugh. It's just it is interesting to consider why we are still using this, because I think the perspective I want to think about is who we define. I'm guessing. Okay, let me cut to the point here. The way that we measure poverty is so dated and outdated that it is much more likely our rate of actual poverty is much higher than what we would consider based on this specific poverty line. Okay, you'll see what I mean here in a minute. So if you click on this, it will take you to what the poverty line calculations are. So the way that this is calculated in the US, it is the number 3 times the cost of a basic diet times the number of people who live in your house. Okay, and this was established during the Johnson administration in the 1960s. Based on how much the average household spent on diet. And at that time, despite what it feels like right now with what we spend on groceries, they seem extremely expensive to me. At that time in the 60s, the average household actually spent more of their basic income on food than on other things. So the government figured, hey, if we're going to fight a war on poverty, we need some sort of measure on who is poor so that we know who needs assistance, etc. Okay. So what the government did, they collaborated with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they said, figure out what the average American household spends on food. And they did that. And then that was about 1/3 of the average household spending. So the government figured, hey, if we take that 1/3 of a basic diet and multiply it times 3, that should cover all of the other necessities a family or an individual would need to sustain themselves. Okay, so they're adjusting for the number of people in the house and the price of food inflation, but they're not adjusting for the price of other necessities inflation. Okay, so that is why I know that's a little complicated, but that is why this is considered absolute poverty. Also, if you it's absolute because it's a 1-0 condition. In other words, the government considers you either poor or not poor. So if you make just above the poverty line, I don't think your life is significantly different than if you make just below it. It's still really, really difficult and a struggle. But if you make just above it, you're not poor per the government. But if you make just below it, you are considered poor. That's why so many different programs like heating assistance, housing assistance, food assistance actually will calculate your eligibility based on above the poverty line, because they know that this number is artificially low, I would say, is the point I'm trying to make. Okay. Here's a little thought exercise that we usually do in class together to kind of consider whether this is really enough money to sustain yourself. So the 2018 poverty line for a family of 4 people was roughly $25,000 a year. Okay, keep in mind this number is supposed to cover all of your basic needs. Like, you're supposed to be able to survive. You're not going to Red Lobster. You're not, shopping at the mall. You're not driving a new car or something like that. But you have enough to feed yourself and shelter yourself. So what we often do is we work through as a class, is this enough money for a family of 4 in Denver and Aurora? I don't think this would even cover rent, frankly. So that's something to think about. The reason this absolute poverty measure we use that took a basic diet and multiplied it times 3 and times the number of people in your house is a problem is, as Americans, we now spend much, much more, especially depending where we live, on housing as a percentage of our income than we do on food. So the problem with this measure is that it doesn't take into account the cost of inflation on housing, and it doesn't differentiate between the cost of rent, food, etc. in Denver compared with rural Minnesota, right, which we know would be much less expensive. So this might be enough for some people depending on where you live, but it's certainly not enough to sustain yourself in Denver, Aurora. Okay, hopefully that made sense. If not, let me know. Have a look at the document I'm going to post. What I want you to remember is this poverty line is supposed to be the minimum level of income you need to exist and your household needs. It is outdated because it's not taking into account how much we spend on transportation, housing, and frankly, health insurance. And instead, it's based on this old calculation of what percentage of our income we would spend on a diet, right, that meets all of our RDA's recommended daily allowance of vitamins, minerals, etc. Okay, so the end of the slides here is just looking through various discussion questions. I'm not going to necessarily go over that. I mostly wanted to talk about the federal poverty line, and then again, I will post this PDF in D2L for you, and I will check in with you soon, and have a great weekend. Thanks.